Marketer channel. Today, we're going to be continuing on our advanced blog and CMS series with episode 23. Now, the focus of today's episode is going to be building a basic authentication for our API. So the previous video where we built the Vue.js component, there was one limitation in that, which is that we didn't have an API authentication set up yet. So we couldn't check whether the URLs we were generating with the component were valid or whether they were unique or not. And we couldn't do that because we didn't have authentication set up for our API. So we didn't really have a way to send an API request to our own server. And so the goal of today's video is to set that up so we can create a few API endpoints so that we can start creating more dynamic portions of our application. So this is something we were going to have to do eventually. So I'm just going to kind of buckle down. Let's get it done in this episode. And then every future video that we need something like that, we can build API endpoints pretty easily, so it won't be too bad. And it's pretty easy to set up. Now, there's different types of authentication you can set up for APIs, and I don't want to go into like a whole tutorial about APIs here, but we will cover setting up one of these, which is the token-based authentication. Now, this is a really easy way to set up authentication. You're basically generating a random 60-character string is what we'll be working with. It doesn't have to be that per se, but we'll be working with a 60-character random string, and we will auto-generate that for every single user in our application. So they'll all have their own auto-generated string. So then when they want to submit an API request, they're going to submit that API token, and then we'll be able to search the database for that API token to identify which user is requesting this information via the API. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. It's very, very simple to set up. We just have to create these tokens and then make sure they're unique. We have to store them in the database and stuff like that. And then Laravel's got some easy token-based authentication. We don't really have to do much. Laravel can handle the bulk of it. Okay, so it's pretty easy to set up. Now, I should mention that if you're sending very secure information, this is not the way to do it. This is a really good way to send information that's not super important. If you're sending personal information, this is not the way to do it. There are other types of authentication like OAuth. There's OAuth 1, preferably you want to work with OAuth 2. And then there's also JWT authentication as well. These are different types of authentication you can work with your APIs, and those are going to be preferable if you're sending very important or secure information over your API. It's a more secure way to authenticate a user and stuff like that. So that's the way you're going to want to send it if you're sending private information. Just keep that in mind, that this is going to be good for sending. This is really good for like internal APIs. In our example, we just want to know whether a URL slug is unique or not. We're going to validate against the token. So we have some basic authentication there, but it's not super, super critical information, right? Whether this slug is unique, just basic stuff like that. So just keep that in mind when you're setting these up. Okay, so now for our tutorial today, we're going to add that column in the database for our API token. So let's do that. And the way I'm actually going to want to do it here is I'm actually going to roll back our entire database and just run it fresh again. And the reason for that is when we create this migration here, in fact, I'm not going to create a migration. I'm just going to work with the original migration we had and just edit it, and then we'll run it again. But because we're creating a unique index, we can't really have other stuff in the database when we create that unique index because the index will fail to run because we'll have a whole bunch of items that don't have any API token. Now, there's ways around that, of course. You could alter the table. You can put an alter statement in your migration here. You could make it nullable and stuff like that. I don't really want to do any of that. It's just not worth it for what we're doing since it's just test data at this point. It would be worth it if we already had like production data and we had to modify the database, but in our case, it's just not worth it. So we're just going to roll back the database, run the seeder again, and just call it a day. So let's go to our original migration. This is the create users table migration. And let's just go through and create a new string. So we're going to create a string, which is a varchar, and we're just going to say API underscore token. Okay, now it's important we call it API underscore token. That's what Laravel's expecting. Of course, you could always customize it and just make sure to tell the model to use something else. But we're just going to call it API token because that's what it's set up for. This is a varchar string, and we're just going to make it 60 characters. And then we're going to create that unique index. I should mention it is Halloween night, and so there have been trick-or-treaters at my door all night, and hopefully I don't have to leave to go answer the door and give away some candy. If I do, I might be coming in and out. I waited until later in the evening when I think most of the trick-or-treaters are done, so hopefully don't get interrupted. If I didn't make the video tonight, then the evening's the best time for me to make videos. If I don't make the video tonight, then it's going to be another day without a video, so I just decided to risk it here. So we might get interrupted with trick-or-treaters. Okay, so let's see. That's all we need to do for our migration. Let's go ahead and we're going to roll back the database, run the migrations to get this new field in, and then let's reseed the database. So back in our terminal, we can do PHP artisan migrate reset. That's just going to roll everything back. Then let's go through, I guess we could have, let's just do a normal migration, I guess. And then we'll get all of our fields now. So now we should have that API token in there. If we go look at the database here, we have our API token field, and it should be, where is it? API token, and it's unique. It's got a unique index. You can see it right here, users API token unique. So we have a unique index, so that's great. There's no one in the database right now, so let's go ahead. Before we actually seed the database, it's not going to work because we're requiring that API token field to be filled, and it's not, because currently our seeder doesn't accommodate that API token. So we need to go ahead and make sure that it's creating an API token for every single new user. So let's go into our Laratrust seeder. And if you just move down this field here until you get to this user, this is where we actually create all the users. So you can see here we create their name, random name, and then we create email and then their password, right? So we're going to do the same thing down here. And I guess you would have to do it down here as well if you're creating it with permissions. We're not doing that. There's the door. I got to go run, give some kids some candy. I'll be right back. All right, so I'm back. So let's go ahead and finish this up. Let's now do, so what we wanted to do is up here where we create the new user. We're creating the name, the email, the password, which is all we needed before. But now we have this new API token field that's required. So we need to go ahead and create that. So we're going to go ahead and create that API token. Keep in mind if you're following along, this is lines 57 through 62, okay? Or 57 through 61, I guess, before we add the new line. And so I'm adding it here to line 61 if you're in the database seeder. There's a few other places we create users. We don't really need to worry about this because in our example, we're not creating these permission users. We're only creating these role users. So we only have to do it right here. So just if you're following along, just do this first one that's on line 57 to 61, okay? So here on line 61, API token, we're going to go ahead and generate a random 60-car character. Okay, this is a random 60-character string. Now you might wonder, how are we going to do that? What are we going to do to create a 60-character string? Well, don't worry, guys. I am going to show you. So here we go. So right here is what we're going to do. So you can see I've already created the function right here. It's a nice little one-liner. And this is what we're going to do to make it cryptographically secure. So it's super important that, it's not, I mean, the best idea is to keep it, do something like this so that it is cryptographically secure or random, and it's not like the normal random integer isn't as random as you would expect it to be. So this keeps, and it's guessable, so it's easy to guess as well because of, that's this whole other thing that we're not going to talk about. But basically, just trust me, it's not secure enough. So what we want to do is we're going to say, we're going to use this OpenSSL function, OpenSSL random pseudo bytes. We're going to generate 30 of those bytes. And then with those 30 random bytes that are cryptographically securely generated, then we're going to go ahead and turn them into and convert them into hexadecimals. So with 30 bytes converted into hexadecimal, we will then get we'll get 60 character long string, and it'll be just exactly what we need. So you can see here if I run it, this is the string that we get that's randomly generated, and it's 60 characters long. And every time we run that, we're going to get another randomly generated string, another 60 characters, right? So it generates, it's going to be pretty hard to duplicate this random of a string that's 60 characters long. It's a mixture of numbers and letters. Notice there's no punctuation. It's important that there are no punctuation. It's too hard to work with punctuation in API tokens. When it gets passed into the request, you've got to encode it, and then you've got to decode it when it comes out. It's just not fun. So trust me when I just do just do something like this. Just do hex so that you've got just letters and numbers, okay? It's going to make it a lot easier to work with. So here we go. So these are the random tokens. And again, you can see this gets randomly generated every time, and it's always going to be 60 characters. This is what we want as our API tokens. So let's go ahead and grab this random generator that I've got, and we're going to put that in here. So this is going to randomly generate our token. I should notice this uses OpenSSL. You have to have the OpenSSL module in PHP set up. So if you are running into problems with this, that's probably why, is because you may not have access to this function because it requires the OpenSSL module. So just go into your PHP modules and make sure that you have the OpenSSL set up. I think most PHP installations nowadays have it by default, so I think it shouldn't be a problem. I think everyone will have it. In fact, I'm almost 100% sure that Laravel requires it. So if you're working with Laravel, I'm pretty sure Laravel requires OpenSSL module in PHP, so I think every Laravel developer should have it. So that's the only reason that may cause problems, is if you don't have OpenSSL. Okay, so that's everything. Now we're going to go ahead. We can go ahead and generate this. So let's go seed the database. That should allow us to generate these users and generate the tokens with them. So let's go over to our terminal here. We're going to do PHP artisan db seed, and that should seed the database. Now let's go take a look. Okay, so now over here, if we refresh, we should have a whole bunch of users. So we got our 7 users, and you can see they all have API tokens, which is exactly what we needed. So, and these are nice long 60 character long strings. All right. So there we go. That's everything we have. We have our database seeder set up. That works good for getting started. Now, of course, we're going to have problems when we create new users in our application because we're not using the database seeder. We're only doing that at the very beginning during development. So this only does us a little bit of good while we're developing our application, but we still need to be able to add and create these API tokens randomly whenever we create a new user. So you might wonder, how do you do that? Well, of course, there's multiple ways to do anything in programming. So there's lots of ways you can handle this. The theoretically easy way would be to just go into your controller, go into user controller, go down here into your store function, and when you create a user, you would just come down here to where we create a new user, name, email, password, create a line for API token, and then create that random API token. And that's one way to solve it. That would be pretty simple. But what we want to do is we don't really want to think about the API token. We just want that to be on the back burner, and we just want that to be automatically generated without us really having to worry about it. So we can go ahead and worry about these other elements, and the token will just get automatically generated whenever we create a new user. And that's really what we want to do, and I'm going to show you guys how to do that. Now, the way we're going to handle that is we're going to be creating something called observers. And observers are something that not a lot of people talk about. It's kind of a, it's something that not a lot of people talk about. So what this is we're going to basically create this concept called an observer that is going to watch our model. And when certain events get triggered, the observer is going to basically take over control of the model. It's going to manipulate the model and then pass it back to the model. Okay, so it kind of just sits here. That's why it's called an observer. It observes the model, and then when we tell it to intervene, it's going to intervene. It's going to manipulate the model the way that we want it to be manipulated, and then it's going to step back out and let the model continue to do its thing. So the model doesn't really have to worry about anything. We can continue to create users like we used to, and the observer is going to manage this API token for us. Okay, so that's what we're going to be setting up. So follow my lead on this one, guys. There's not a lot of documentation about observers, but they're very, very powerful. So get ready to see this. This is cool. All right, so what we're going to do is inside of our app, we're going to create a new folder called for our observers. So observers. Yep, there we go. Okay, so we got a folder for our observers. We're going to create a new observer in here. So to do that, let's create a new file. There is no generator for this that I know of. Actually, let's check. PHP artisan make help. Okay, so we have auth command, event, exception, factory job, listener mail, model, notification policy, provider, request, resource rule. Okay, so there is no observer generator, so we've got to do this on our own. So we're going to create a new file. We're going to call it user observer. okay? Because we're creating an observer that's going to observe over the user model. These observers tie to models, okay? So you create one for the model that you want to observe. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and pass this in here. Now, let's go over to the Laravel documentation to get kind of a template for our observer. You can search it up here at the top, observer. You can see right here, getting started observers. I think this is right. Here we go. So here's observers. So here's a template for our observer that we can use. So we're just going to go ahead and copy this and then paste it into here. Okay, now we've namespaced into app observers, which works out perfect. We've already created app observers. This one, the template from Laravel is actually set up for user, which is nice. So this is already set up to be user observer, which is what we called ours. So that's convenient. And it's already pulling in user, which is also convenient. Now you can see there's a few events that it's watching onto here, the created event and the deleting event. Now, of course, you can tie into any events that you want. And so we're not going to need this deleting event. We can always create it later and observe the deleting event, but that's not super important for us. What we want to observe is this right here, this creating event. Now, you'll notice here this is called created. Now, the created event triggers after the model has been saved into the database. Unfortunately, that's not the best time for us to get involved or for the observer to intervene. We want it to intervene before it gets saved into the database, right? Because we want to manipulate the model before it gets saved in the database because we want to add that API token. If we add that nullable API token, it's a little too late, right? So what we want to do is work on, instead of the created event, we want to work with the creating event. Now the creating event is, and this is, I'm just going to do that up there. The creating event is triggered right before it's saved into the database. So everything else will go through the model, and then as it gets triggered over, right before it gets passed over to actually be put into the database, the creating event will get triggered, and that's when our observer will jump in, intervene, manipulate the model, add that API token, step back away, and let the save continue to run. Okay, so, and you could do multiple. You could also intervene again after it's been created. We don't need to do that. We just need to get involved here during the creating process. Okay, so now that we got that, what we can do is you can see we have access to the user model, right? Because that's what we're observing. So we're intervening and manipulating the user model. So we're going to go ahead and grab that user model that's currently getting ready to be saved, and we're going to add the API token, just like you would if you were saving it over in our controller, right? We're going to do it the exact same way, and then we're going to go ahead and create that that randomly generated token. So if we come over here and just grab this again, and then paste, there we go. So now we should have that just like that. That's it. That's all it takes. So we're just going to add that one line. You could do other stuff and fancier stuff, but this is all we're going to get involved in. So that's all the observer needs to do. And that's it. So now our observer is done. That's it. It's all the observer needs to do. Now the one problem is the observer is not set up to actually observe yet. So we just created the file, we told it what to do, but it's not going to get triggered when it's not actually set up to be an official observer. So we need to do that by setting it up inside of our service providers. We need to create a service provider to tie the observer to the model, because right now the model doesn't know about this observer, or the observer doesn't know about the model, right? We need to connect them together. So we're going to connect them inside of this service provider. Now you can do it right here inside of the app service provider, but what we're going to do is we're going to create a service provider specifically for all of our observers, which right now we only have one, but it's very likely that we'll have multiple in the future here. So we're going to go PHP artisan make provider, and then we're going to create an observer service provider. Okay, there we go. We created a new provider. And if we come over here, we have a new observer service provider, just like that. And inside of our boot function, we're going to tell it to go ahead and tie the user model to the user observer. So what we can do is down over here, we're just going to say, and make sure it's in the boot function, not the register. We're going to say user and observe. And then we're going to tell it that to use the user observer. And that's it. That's really all it takes. That's it for the provider. Now let's go ahead and make sure these are registered, the user and the user observer. So use app user, and then use app observers, and then user observer, like that. Perfect. I think that's good. Yeah, that's everything. So That's literally everything. I'm like trying to think. I think that's everything we need to do. Let's go ahead and test it now. So, oh, that's not everything. We need to actually make the observer, or the provider, I'm sorry. We need to load the provider because by default, all the providers need to be configured inside of our config/app. So let's go into our config/app and just make sure we get that observer, that new provider set up. Okay, so here's all the service providers under the providers array. Down here at the bottom, let's just copy one of these, paste it in, and then we'll just change this to be observer service provider. Okay, so what this is doing is this is telling it to load the service provider. Now it's going to load the service provider, and then our service provider tells it to link the user model to the user observer. Okay, so that's why we had to do that. Now I think it should all work. Yeah. Okay, so let's do it now. So let's go over to our browser. Login. Let's log in. Super administrator at app.com. Password is the password. There we go. We're logged in as super administrator. Let's go down to manage now, and let's manage a new user. Create a new user. Okay. So here's our users. We've got these 7 users. Let's create a new user, and let's generate this new user. Now notice I'm not creating a field for API. We didn't edit this field. We didn't do anything. We didn't even touch the controller. If you look at our under app controllers, notice the controller never got edited, right? These yellow files and green files are edited. So there's no, this user controller never actually got edited. We didn't have to touch this. We also noticed the resources never got touched. We didn't have to mess with any of this. It's all happening behind the scenes. This is what makes it observers kind of cool. So let's go ahead and set this up. We'll say the guy's name is John Doe, and his email is john@doe.com. We'll just auto-generate a password's fine, and then we will just turn him into a author. Okay? Create a new user. There we go. We got a brand new user, John Doe. John@doe.com. He's an author is his role. Okay, that's all we need to do. So now let's go take a look at our at SQL Pro here and refresh. What's that button do? Toggle between editing symbols. Oh, interesting. I didn't even know about that button. Okay, so refresh. Here we got John Doe, and John Doe now has an API token. See that? And it's just as long as all the other ones. So that observer went ahead, triggered that API token, saved it in the database, despite the fact that we don't actually have anything in our controller, in our store function. There's nothing in here to indicate that we should have an API token. The observer is what added that. So it's pretty cool stuff. And you can tie into all sorts of events with Observer. You can do creating, created, saving, saved, after it's saved, it would be saved, updating, updated, deleted, deleting. There's probably a couple others. I just don't know all of them off the top of my head. But that's there's a bunch of events that you can tie into to any step in the process. Great. So that's basically, we have authentication set up. Now let's go ahead and actually let's test it. So let's create a route in our API. Now we're going to go into our route/api.php to create an API route. We actually already have an API route here that's created by default. Let's just go ahead and use this as a sample. So you can see this uses the auth API middleware. And it's got a get request to /user. And what this is going to do is there's just a basic closure here. It's just going to get the current user that requests their information. It's basically going to give the information of the user that requests it. Give them back all the information we have about them. Okay. Now notice we're using this auth API. Where does this middleware come from? Well, it comes inside of our config folder under auth. You can see we have some guards set up. We have this API guard. And this is where I talked about the different types of authentication. There's token-based authentication. There's JWT and OAuth. Notice here we're using token-based authentication. That's the driver we were using, which is the default. But this is where you would configure it. But it's configured for token already in Laravel, so you don't have to do anything. And then the user's provider. Okay, so and then the providers are down here. And it uses the eloquent model, the whatever. You guys know how to do all this. We've done that before with another series, I think. Okay, so yeah, that's everything. So this is really ready to go, and we can see that this, if we run PHP artisan route list, we can see that we've got that API route. So here we have API/user, and you can see that over here, it uses the API middleware with the auth API middleware. So right now it's going to authenticate against that token and it's going to look in that token column. So let's go ahead and test it. Let's submit a request to this API. Let's make sure our API is working, and then we'll finish up the video. All right, so we're going to send a request to this /API/user. So let's go ahead and do it. Let's go ahead and open up some sort of REST HTTP client. Go ahead and get that up and running, and let's create this. So we're going to just say dev marketer. Now notice here that I'm using Insomnia as my REST client. You can use any client that you want. So if you want Insomnia, it's free, and certain features are free, I think, and it's available cross-platform. I'm also pretty sure. I think it's available Windows, Linux, and Mac. So you guys can use this. Another really popular one, if you guys want to use that, is Postman. You can go ahead and download Postman. Postman is clunky and slow. Look how long it took to boot up. And now everything, like, look at how much I got to sign in apparently. I don't even know. I don't even know if I have it's been a while since I've used it. Okay, so I'm just going to use Insomnia, but you guys can use Postman. It'll work the same. Okay, so what we're going to do here, we're going to put in the URL that we're going to hit. So we're going to do devmarketer.dev/API/user, right? So we're just hitting up this right here is the goal. So we're doing /API/user. Then let's go ahead in our queries here. Let's go ahead and add API token and as a query, and then let's give it our API token. So we can get that from the database. Let's just grab John Doe's new API token, grab it, copy it, and then we're going to paste it in here. And there we go. So now we've got his API token. And now let's go ahead and just submit the request. And there we go. We get our JSON back as a return. So you can see we have John Doe's information. His ID number is 8. There's his name. There's his email address, his API token. He was created earlier tonight. All right. So it is working perfectly. Now, if we go through and just delete some of John's token here, so it's not a valid API token anymore, and we go ahead and just resubmit it, you can see it tries to get us to log in. So the authentication is working. It's not letting him get his information because he didn't provide a proper proper authentication. That API token is his authentication. So, all right, guys. So hopefully you guys found that interesting. We are now set up for APIs. So the only thing really we need to do to get an API working is just create the endpoint. So now back in our application, create a route, tie it to a controller, create a function in the controller to do something, and then return it back to the user. It's going to work just like any other controller action basically at this point, but we'll just create the routes inside of our API inside of this API routes file so that it's wrapped in with the API middleware and so forth. So that's basically it. But as of right now, our API is working. So in the next video, we can actually go back. Let's go work on our Vue.js component, and we're going to create a URL, an API endpoint to check whether the slug is unique. And we'll send that via an API request. We'll use our fancy new API tokens, and then we'll get a response back that either says if it's unique or not unique. And if it's not unique, we will change the URL to try to make it unique, and then send it again to see if that new one is unique. And we'll kind of keep doing that until we can create a unique token. So that's the goal of next video. So I'll see you guys over there in the very next video where we put this API use to good use.